The sun was just setting on a clear and brisk fall evening as Diane began making her way home through the winding, cobbled streets of the city. In the countryside, it might have been a lovely twilight, but much of its beauty was lost here. The tall brick buildings crowded close to both the streets and each other, obscuring the sunset and plunging the ground below into deep shadow. The street lights had already been on for quite some time. They cast sickly yellow pools of artificial light around their immediate area, but somehow never managed to bridge the gap between adjacent light posts entirely. They were bright enough, however, to hide most of the stars from view, leaving the sky above the city a dull, undifferentiated gray slowly fading to black. Incidentally, if one were to gaze up at this uninspiring sky while walking between the close-set buildings, and if the haze and shadows were just right, the tops of the structures would seem to lean in and reach towards each other ever so slightly, as if trying to enfold the street like a giant hand and block out the sky completely. It was enough to make even a deserted street seem unbearably claustrophobic. Diane did not gaze up at the uninspiring sky as she walked home. She also did not gaze left, or right, or anywhere else except forward and slightly downward, fixating on the cracked and uneven brick road immediately ahead of her. Walking the city alone at nightfall could be dangerous, and she knew it. And while it was not quite late enough to mark the transition from mildly risky to downright stupid, it was still plenty late enough for Diane to feel uncomfortable. She walked briskly, ignoring the shadows of strangers passing on either side of her, the lights and laughter from pubs and shops lining the street, and the dark, gaping mouths of the shadowy alleyways in between. She wanted nothing more than to be at home, curled up in front of the fire with a good book, and she silently cursed her poor planning as the streets darkened around her. Gradually, such that she could not pinpoint exactly when it began, Diane became aware of a feeling of trepidation exceeding her usual late-night jitters. A shiver drifted down her spine and she quickened her step, trying to pinpoint the origin of the feeling. It was the sort of feeling one often experiences when alone in dark places, a slight increase in heart rate, a prickle of goosebumps, a creeping sense of unease, and above all, the vague but undeniable feeling that you are being watched. Such feelings are often triggered by something, a movement caught from the corner of the eye, an unexplained noise, a cold breeze, and so on. Diane couldn't tell what the trigger had been this time, and it bugged her. Around her, the city went about its usual evening routine, not quite bustling but not yet quiet, seemingly oblivious to the presence of one specific young woman among the many citizens going about their business. Still, the sense of being watched would not leave Diane, no matter how much she tried to rationalize it away. It tugged at the corners of her mind, raising the hairs on the back of her neck and sending waves of tension throughout her body. Almost home, she thought, just a few more minutes of walking, just got to get home. But the uneasy feeling only gained momentum as she hurried down the night streets towards her warm little townhouse. Diane became increasingly alert, listening vigilantly to the sounds of the city, the whistle of the wind through the buildings, the boisterous merrymaking from the pubs, the hushed conversations of passerby, the buzzing of the streetlights, her own footsteps echoing across the cobblestones. Wait, she was suddenly seized with a flash of intuition. Her feeling was not merely one of being watched, it was one of being followed. As she focused down to the sound of her footsteps, she thought she heard a strange echo in them. Although she walked this same road in these same shoes almost every day, there was something unfamiliar in the pitch and timbre of her footfalls, something foreign, as if someone was walking completely in step with her, following just behind her. The mere thought was enough to ratchet her vague uneasiness up a notch into real fear. Heart beating fast, palms sweating, she steeled herself and glanced around backwards to glimpse her pursuer. No one. The street behind her was almost empty, the closest other pedestrians being a group of 3 apparently tipsy young men staggering away in the opposite direction. Just my imagination, she thought, but oddly this thought did not bring relief, for the feeling persisted after she turned back around. If anything, it grew stronger. She felt the weight of another's gaze fixed on the back of her head. Her mouth grew dry. Her hands trembled. The clicking of her footsteps seemed to swell to the exclusion of all other sound, a hollow click-clack projecting into a silence that now seemed as heavy and suffocating as a down blanket. She listened desperately, trying to catch her phantom pursuer in a misstep, or at least to pick out the foreign sound that had made her suspect its presence in the first place. But the difference was impossible to pinpoint with her rational mind, despite the insistence of her subconscious that something was amiss. Attempting to confuse her pursuer, if indeed there was one, she walked a bit faster, then rapidly slowed, then did a series of little offbeat trips, skips, and hops, all of which availed her nothing, except perhaps to make her look completely ridiculous to passerby. And yet the strange echo continued, nebulous and elusive, fraying her nerves and feeding the mounting dread that now possessed her. Ever since Diane was a child, she'd had a very active imagination. As a young girl she was afraid of the dark and the quiet more than anything else, for her mind would fill it with waiting monsters and phantom noises. Every night after her parents put her to bed, she would switch on the little lamp on her bedside table and sleep with the light on. If her parents noticed, which they sometimes did, they would come in and turn the light back off again. She hated it when this happened, for if she awoke with the light off, she would never be able to reach over and turn it back on again. The 6-inch gap between her bed and her nightstand became an unbridgeable void of dark menace. The young Diane was convinced that, the moment she tried to reach across, monstrous hands would reach up from under her bed, grab her exposed wrist, and drag her screaming into the shadows. Only the magical rectangle that constituted the top of her bed was safe, acting on the monsters as a circle of salt might act on a witch. And even the bed might not be safe if a really bad thing was lurking in the darkness. There amongst the vague, half-imagined terrors of a child's imagination would Diane lie, mute and paralyzed, sleepless until the morning sun finally shone through her bedroom window. It was horrible. And God forbid she should have to use the bathroom. Yes, Diane knew that she had an overactive imagination, but she thought she had conquered it years ago. She was a grown woman now, not a child. She shouldn't be imagining things. And yet, the certainty of being observed, followed, hunted refused to disappear. Someone or something was following behind her, some deep intuitive part of her knew it. She was not a child anymore, and with every passing moment, she became more and more certain that she was not imagining this. And she became more and more afraid. Maybe whoever it was just ducked into an alley or dodged out of sight the last time I turned around. That's possible, she thought. With this in mind, she bit her lip, steeled herself, and without warning whipped around as fast as she could, turning her whole body to face her assailant. Nothing, an empty street. The sight of the dark, empty passage behind her nearly sent Diane into a full-blown panic attack. The shadows, the buildings, the very air itself seemed to pulsate with malicious intent, as if the city she now saw was merely a thin veil draped over a writhing, seething mass of. It was suddenly very difficult for Diane to breathe. A weight pressed against her chest and her eyes welled with terrified tears. Her body shook like a leaf. It took every last iota of her self-control not to shriek like a madwoman right there in the middle of the street. She was suddenly seized with a strong and urgent compulsion to get indoors, to seek shelter from the terror, however irrational, that seemed to stalk the streets. She turned quickly back around and darted into the nearest lit building, letting the door slam behind her without turning back. She collapsed against the wall next to the door, eyes closed, breathing like she had just run a marathon. For a few moments she just stood there like that, calming herself down and trying to regain control of her breathing. Only then did she open her eyes to survey the room she had just entered. Diane had, in her terror, stumbled into a small pub. The place was a bit dingy and not particularly well lit, but at least it was brighter than outside, and the few patrons seated in small groups throughout the establishment seemed friendly and respectable enough, at least upon first inspection. A couple of them were glancing over in her direction, their curiosity perhaps aroused by her strange, panicked entrance, or perhaps simply by the fact that she seemed to be the only woman in the place except for one slightly harried-looking waitress. Diane still felt a bit uneasy, both from the attention and from her feeling of being followed in the street, but coming inside had managed to dissolve the worst of her panic. She did not in the least feel ready to venture back out into the street, though, so instead she sat down quietly at a vacant, two-person table near the door and tried to collect her thoughts. After a minute or so, the waitress she had noticed earlier came by and asked Diane politely if she would like anything to drink. Diane requested just a cup of hot tea please, if they had it, and the waitress gave her a kind, understanding smile and a pat on the back of the hand before bustling off to fill the order. By this point, Diane felt much better, although the lingering feeling of being watched still persisted in the back of her mind. She was seated with her back to the front door and window of the pub, and a small part of her was still convinced that someone or something was looking in on her through that window. However, she pushed this idea away as firmly as she could, telling herself that she was being ridiculous, that it all must have been nothing more than her imagination. She had gone a fair ways towards convincing herself this was true when a man slid casually into the seat across from her. Well aware that she was the only female patron in the pub, Diane opened her mouth to tell the man that she was not interested in flirting, but stopped when she got a closer look at him. The man was a lot older than she had expected, old enough to be her father. He had short, graying brown hair and a slight stubble across his cheeks, and the skin around his bright blue eyes was wrinkled not only with age, but with the kindly and wise smile that stretched across his face. Overall, he had a caring, patriarchal aura that, along with the golden wedding band she noticed on his left ring finger, suggested to Diane that this was not some young, self-styled Casanova looking for a date. Forgive a stranger fair soundin' nosy, but, are you doing right, lass? You're lookin' a mite troubled, and you stormed in here earlier like you was in a downright panic. His voice was deep and rugged, but also soft, carrying a lilting accent that was somehow soothing to Diane. Oh, I'm doing all right, Diane responded sheepishly, just had a bit of a fright on my way home. Nothing really, just my imagination I suppose. Bit embarrassing, actually. I just wanted to stop in, get a bit of a hot drink and calm down before heading back home for the night. The man nodded understandingly, taking a short gulp from his own mug as the waitress returned with Diane's tea. As the waitress left, he responded, yeah, these city streets can be a touch daunting at night, what with everything being so damn packed in. Not all safe for a young lass walking alone either, he added with a stern look. Diane nodded her understanding and sipped her tea with an embarrassed blush, looking down into her cup rather than at her companion. What was it put such a fright into ya, anyhow? Oh, like I said, nothing really, Diane responded, just a creepy feeling I got. Nothing to worry about. The man set down his mug and leaned his chin on his hand. Why don't you tell me a bit about it, lass? Talkin' about these things has a way makin' em feel better, sometimes. Normally, Diane wouldn't want to reveal something so embarrassing, particularly to a stranger, but she still felt in need of a bit of comfort, and the man seemed so sincere, she wound up telling him the whole story. Surprisingly, instead of nodding his encouragement or even looking amused at her folly, the man's face seemed to grow darker and more troubled as Diane's story progressed. When she had finally finished, the man sat there in silence for more than a minute, biting his lip and staring into his mug. Finally, Diane felt the silence had gotten too unnerving, and said to him, sir. Oh, he exhaled in surprise, looking up from his mug. Oh, sorry lass, I dinna mean to ignore ya. It's just what? Diane asked, a creeping feeling of dread starting to seep back into her body. Well, you hear stories round here, lass. Superstitious nonsense, the most of 'em, but there's no denying, there's some stuff that happens round about these parts at night that just ain't been explained. And what you just told me sounds an awful lot like one old story I hear now and again. An icy chill went down Diane's spine. What story? The man drummed his fingers nervously on the table, looking torn. Look, I don't wanna put a fright in you fair no reason lass, but I was raised in a real superstitious family, and curse me if it ain't been passed along enough for me to think that it'd be riskin' your safety not to tell ya. Tell me what, please, I want to hear this, even if it is just superstitious. Well, as tales would have it, there's this thing that comes around the streets at night, in the city like this. Some kinda monster, or ghost, but nobody knows what it really is, or what it looks like. And every now and then, for some reason it'll latch on, somebody, and follow 'em around, walking right behind 'em as they go about their business. Catch is, why see, it ain't really real. At least not in our world, not normally. I don't get all that weird metaphysics stuff or nothin', but supposedly it's on some kinda other plane, for the most part. One that overlaps with our world but isn't really a part of it, like it's below what we can see and feel, and most people go through their lives hardly even knowing it's there. Unless something there takes a shine to ya. Even then, it can't do much, it can see ya, and it can follow ya around, but it can't really harm ya, see, 'cause it's not really there. In fact, some people don't notice it following me at all, just go on about their evenings without a care in the world. But others, people who are more sensitive, more open to stuff that ain't exactly rational and concrete, they'll notice it following 'em. They'll feel a cold chill on their backs, a sense of being stalked, like a sixth sense or something. May even hear it following 'em, just a bit, or catch a quick glimpse of it, just for a moment out of the corner of their eye. Never more than that, 'cause it's not really there, remember? At least not yet. Diane gulped. Yet? That's why it's the sensitive ones that have to worry about it. If you don't notice it, it's CN follow ya, round till the cows come home and not make one lick of difference. If you do notice it, though, if you start feeling it, and seeing it, and expecting it, well, it starts getting more real to ya, done it? And as it starts getting more real to you, it starts getting more real period. The man paused for a moment. You said you looked back at the thing twice, didn't you? Riveted by the man's story, and practically speechless with fear, Diane simply gave a series of quick, twitchy nods in response. Well, don't get too scared now, lass, but they say it's the lookin' what gives it its real strength, looking back and expecting with all your heart to see something there. That brings it closer to this plane, makes it more solid. The first time you look back at it, it immediately starts to feel more real to ya. Whatever spooked feelings you maybe had before, they'll go up tenfold after you look back. The footsteps get louder, the glimpses clearer. You'll be more and more convinced that something is following you around. Same thing happens the second time you look back. Fear gets jacked up another notch. Monster gets closer and more solid. Starts following right behind you, breathing down your neck. It knows it's getting near the kill. They say the trepidation is near unbearable. You feel compelled to look around one more time. But that's the one thing you should never do. 'Cause that third look is all it takes to bring that thing full on into our world. Real and solid as you are. Turn around that third time, and you'll be looking it straight in the eye. No one knows exactly what you'll be looking at, mind you. Some say it don't even have a form of its own, till you give it one, and that when you do, it'll be your worst nightmare. Your own personal boogeyman, whatever thing, real or imaginary, scares you the most on God's green earth, that's what it'll look like. But o' course, that's all speculation, 'cause so far as I know there ain't no one who's seen that thing and lived to tell about it. That's the only thing 'bout it that's for sure. It's a murderous, evil thing with an unholy hunger for human flesh and bone. The moment you see it, it'll seize on ya and tear you limb from limb, rip ya apart and disembowel ya while you're still alive and screamin', "Savon, your head fair last." Only thing what the police will find of ya when it's done will be some ripped up, bloody clothes and, maybe a few slivers of bone. Some say that ain't even the worst part though. Some say that after it's done devour your flesh, that thing'll steal your very soul and drag it into that other world it comes from, and there it'll torment you fair all eternity. Still just speculation, but it's about as plausible as anything else in the story. By this time, Diane was as white as a sheet and trembling in sheer terror. She felt certain that the awful monster the man had described was exactly what was stalking her. The story had reiterated exactly how she had felt while walking out on the street a few minutes earlier. What do I do?" she asked the man in a pleading voice. "How do I get away from this thing? Did I lose it by coming in here?" The man shook his head mournfully. "Probably not, lass. From what I heard, don't give up that easily. Even if it didn't follow ya in here, which would explain you feeling a bit better, it's probably still standing outside waitin' for ya. It's smart. It knows this ain't your home, and it's really determined. It wants ya. I'm sure you could tell." Diane hid her face in her hands and let out a quiet sob. Yes, she could tell. She could feel its horrible eyes on her through the window even now, boring into the back of her head. "Then what do I do?" she asked, her voice trembling with repressed tears. "How can I make it go away? There has to be a way. There just has to be. This is your last chance. Your last chance to face your fear." But of course that was idiotic. Facing her fears may have been her grandmother's advice, and it may have been good advice, but her grandmother had never faced a situation like this. If Diane turned around, she was dead, or worse, and she knew it. Facing this fear would neither arm her with knowledge nor make it disappear, it would only arm the monster. So, ignoring her instincts and her grandmother's advice, Diane closed her eyes and turned the music box over in her hands. Tenebras non timeo, quia nihil resident. More creaking behind her. Tenebras non timeo, quia nihil resident. Rustling, a bump, a sound, perhaps, like a door sliding open or shut. Tenebras non timeo, quia nihil resident. Silence. Taking a deep breath, Diane opened her eyes, set down the music box, and turned around. Behind her was only her empty room, quiet and secure in its familiarity. No monsters, no phantom noises, no unseen presences invading her mind. Diane felt a profound sense of relief and safety. She was home, safe and secure in her own home, and her pursuer was finally gone, banished, never to return. She practically skipped back down the steps to lock her front door, which, it turned out, was closed after all. After that, she took a brief moment in the kitchen to fix herself a glass of warm milk before heading up to bed. Settling down to sleep for the night, Diane realized that she still felt a slight sense of tension and unease, but it was nothing compared to what she'd just experienced, and what did she expect after such a traumatizing event? Everything would be better in the morning, the man had told her so. Besides, even as a child, Diane had always felt the safest at home in her own bed. She snuggled up tightly in the covers, rested her head on her soft pillows, and was soon falling into the warm embrace of much-needed sleep. Sometime in the middle of that night, Diane awoke from her quiet, restful slumber. She woke up slowly, as one often does from the deeper stages of sleep, and for a while was unaware of exactly what had woken her. Her mouth seemed as dry as cotton, and she felt strangely uncomfortable, but she didn't think that was what had roused her. Finally, in her groggy, half-awake state, she recognized the sound of a music box playing. Her grandmother's music box, playing, "I Whistle a Happy Tune." Normally, that tune made her feel happy and secure, but now, it somehow unnerved her. Coming awake a little bit more, she realized, wait, how could the music box be playing right now? Someone would have to have wound it. When the full implications of that thought hit her, it snapped her into full awareness like a splash of cold water. She bolted upright in bed, or would have, if she had been able. Unfortunately, she found her movement restricted, and all that her attempt to sit up accomplished was to send shooting pains through her wrists and ankles. Badly frightened now, she attempted to cry out, but found her cry. That cottony feeling in her mouth had not been just from dryness, she was gagged. And the pains in her wrists and ankles, twisting around experimentally and looking down at the foot of her bed, she found that she was tied down to her bedposts with thick ropes. Just as she thought that she could not get any more terrified, she heard a sound above the music box that sent her spiraling into depths of panic she hadn't even known existed, the chilling sound of metal sliding against metal. Diane struggled with all her might, pulling at her bonds and making muffled noises through the cloth gag, but the ropes held tight, and no noise she made was nearly loud enough to penetrate the walls of the room. Suddenly, off to her right, a voice spoke to her. "Ah, you're awake then. You're quite the heavy sleeper, you know. Didn't even flinch when I was tying you down, yet a little music does the trick right quick. Odd, eh?" The voice, obviously masculine, sounded ridiculously conversational given the extremity of the situation and the disturbing content of its words. It also seemed vaguely familiar. "It's funny, I was sure for a second there I was gonna be caught. When I stepped on that damn creaky floorboard, I thought for sure you were gonna turn around, then you would have screamed blue murder and probably woke up the whole damned neighborhood, ruined everything, that woulda. But you're good at following instructions, ain't ya? Never turned around once, right?" "Yeah, one determined wench, and I couldn't be happier 'bout it." The voice chuckled darkly as Diane continued to struggle pointlessly, and the sound of grinding metal continued to grate on her ears. "Determined and superstitious, yep, that there's one hell of a combination. Just to put your mind at ease, you should know that there ain't no ghoulies or ghosties following ya from another world. Nothing's tryin' to steal your soul. Those footsteps you heard behind ya on your way to the pub, those were probably nothing, except your imagination running away with ya. Those footsteps you heard after ya stopped in at the pub though." Diane's captor slowly stepped into her field of vision. It was the man from the pub, his once kind smile now twisted into a mocking grin of pure malice and predatory excitement. In his hand was a vicious-looking, freshly sharpened butcher knife. With a cruel chuckle, the man finished, "Well, those were me.